Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. I love this. Enriching lives, inspiring a nation. That's a powerful guiding principle. Beautiful stuff. As Dave already mentioned, my wife and I arrived here a few days earlier last week, and we spent a couple of days based in Nelson, exploring just a bit of the Abel Tasman National Park. Beautiful, extraordinary place. And on Saturday morning, we were wandering around out on the wharf there, and I saw something that to me epitomises what I love about this country. But there was something going on, so we were, what's that? So we thought it was some sort of sideshow. We went over, and there were these young kids leaping off this tower into the water. You know, the wharf jump. And I thought, fantastic. Then when I looked more closely, I realised this had been deliberately organised. Someone had built this platform specifically, made a few rules, and the rules were great, you know. No diving, just jumping, one person at a time. Common sense stuff. Fantastic. And I thought, how intelligent. Because young people need to push themselves, they need to challenge themselves, they need to break the rules. Now here we have a relatively safe environment for them to actually do all that manhood, womanhood stuff, leaping 10 metres into the water. You see, in my country, kids leap off wharfs also, but it's illegal. Several $1,000 fine. So people do it in risky, stupid ways, and every year someone breaks their back or their neck because they've leapt into shallow water. So, good stuff. So, we're here about complex adaptive systems. This has been around for about 20 years. It's not new. And it draws on 4 streams: quantum physics, chaos theory, evolutionary biology, systems thinking. Now, it's been around for years, yet it's hardly touched the business world. It's hardly touched leadership thinking. There are a few notable exceptions. The government of Singapore is using this stuff for its future planning. After 9/11, the US military realised they had to change their game, that their traditional command and control game wouldn't work, that if you're going to defeat a networked enemy, you have to become a network. So the US military has spent a lot of time and energy in changing the way they operate, making themselves much more free-flowing and networked. Decentralised to the edge of discomfort is one of their rallying cries. I started working with this stuff in Sweden about 8-10 years ago, working with research scientists, building the network society. So there's pockets around the world that are touching this, but by and large, it's hardly known. Now, why is that? One reason is that this stuff challenges the way you see the world. It's very confronting. It challenges control. It challenges independent volition, choice. It challenges this idea that the world's a predictable place. So it's been around a long time, but it's hardly touched the world. I think it's very forward-thinking to really focus on this area, because this is the future. Now, it challenges the way we see the world. Now, the world out there and the way we see it are intimately interconnected. There's this resonant dance between our mental model, our worldview, our mindset, and the world we see. Because the place we look from, our attitude, our mental model, our paradigm, challenges, changes, distorts, colours, and obscures the world. And the world itself colours and changes the way we see the world. So this dance is always going on. Now I want to explore it using 3 words: simple, complicated, and complex. Because when you look at the world out there, some things are simple. For example, baking a cake. That's simple. You've got a recipe, you've got the ingredients, follow the steps, produce a cake. Do it again, and you'll produce a cake pretty much like the last one. In the simple view, simple aspects of the world, a working definition is that it's linear. Cause and effect are obvious, clear, and repeatable. We're all okay with that? Many things are not simple, they're complicated. Working definition, causation is still there. It's linear, yet it's not so clear. You need experts, you need expertise, you need analysis to understand this complicated part of the world. An example is building a rocket. That takes many experts, many different disciplines, a lot of deep thinking and analysis, and you have to schedule it. And yet when you look at a PERT chart or a Gantt chart, you discover that within this complicated mass of ideas and plans, there are many, many simple tasks that are sort of subtasks. That's already a hint. The simple is embedded within the complicated. And some things in the world are neither simple nor complicated, they're complex. Raising a baby, that's complex. Please indicate if you're a parent. Wow, we're a fertile lot, aren't we? The rest of you, you know what I mean, these little things. Now, raising a baby is a complex matter. You know, it's not simple. Yes, you can go and get the simple 7 steps for raising a baby. That'll help, won't it? Or you can go and do the parenting courses, the complicated things with the experts. That'll help. All these things, they do a little bit. A baby is a mystery. And it arises in the interaction, in the play between the parents and the parenting figures and the child. You make mistakes, trial and error, you learn, then you grow the child. Then, of course, you get the next one. Oh, it's simple. You know what to do now, don't you? No. Our first child, a boy, he was into mountain bikes, motorbikes, into punk rock. He had a mildly famous band called Hippie War Generals with songs like Lock Up Your Rolls, Stick 'Em in the Home. So, you know, it's the boy's boy. Our second child was a girl. She was into musical comedy, Oklahoma, Gilbert and Sullivan, wanted to be an opera singer. So like all the learning, not repeatable. Because that's the thing about complexity. Cause and effect are only known afterwards. There's no clear connections. Afterwards you go, oh yes, Y happened because of A, B and C. But if you do A, B and C again, you'll probably get W or Q. Complexity. Now, relationships, leadership, culture, innovation, creativity, that's all in the complex domain. Now, that's the world out there. Some things are simple, some things are complicated, and some really important things are complex. When it gets really interesting is when we start looking in here. Our worldview. Because some people have a simple worldview. They assume everything is knowable, that it's linear, they think in a linear way, cause, effect. From effect, cause. You could call this a process view. Focus on the process. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And it works for some things. It works for simple things. So if you're holding that simple mindset and you look at something simple like baking a cake or a recipe, you go, yeah, of course you see it. Yep, that's obvious. Step, step, step. Yep, got it. Yet if you look with that simple mindset at something complicated, you don't really get it. You can grasp aspects of it. You can see the sub-bits that are simple. Yet the subtleties of all the complications, it eludes you. And if you look at something complex, like building a culture, developing leaders, creating an environment for innovation, You cannot get that with a simple mindset. And you see, most of our models are simple because we reduce to simplify. Now, there's nothing wrong with that as long as we realise. I could take an A4 sheet of paper and I could have a map of this conference centre, this hotel. On that same size A4 map, I could have a map of Wellington, or a map of New Zealand, or a map of the world. And of course, I have to remove details to actually get it to fit in the simple domain. Now, that's what we do. All of our models are like that. I love economic modelling. Let's reduce all the variables that will actually cause confusion. Let's just keep a simple, stable environment. Here's the inputs. That'll be your result. We have a treasury in the government who spits out a model of forecasts every few years. They're always wrong. The only thing that's predictable is that they're wrong. And they'll have world events, something happened. Of course it did. That's called life. It's called complexity. So, simple mindset, good for simple things, inadequate for looking at the world. The modern world, this is where the vast majority of people are, they hold this paradigm, the complicated paradigm. This is the rational mind. It's sophisticated. These people talk about evidence-based practice. They're into judging. Nothing wrong with that. This mindset can solve many things, deals with the complications. It's wonderful stuff. Yet it misses the juice, the nuances of complexity. With a complicated mind, you can work out some things about relationships and leadership or culture or innovation, yet you miss the juice, the nuances, the subtlety. To understand complexity, you need to open up to complexity. Because this is a different mindset, the complex paradigm. Someone who's looking with the mind of complexity is comfortable being uncomfortable. They know it's okay if they don't know the answer. They don't have to be right. Very different approach. Where this particularly shows up is when things stuff up, when things go wrong. When things go wrong, someone who's holding the simple frame often gets into blame. And, focus on the process, redouble the efforts on the process view. It reminds me, and I'm sure you've had this experience, you're in a foreign country where they don't speak English. There's an English speaker, it's usually an American for some reason, and they're trying to find directions. And the natives are speaking the local tongue. So what do they do when they can't hear? They can't understand each other? They yell louder. So when things go wrong, the simple mind just doubles intensity on the same old way of doing things. The complicated modern mind, where things aren't working, justifies. It's because we didn't have enough experts. We didn't have enough expertise. We didn't do the right analysis. We had more time. May or may not be true. So, both the simple mind and the complicated mind, when things aren't working, they contract and tighten up. This is a paradigm shift. The complex domain, a complex thinker, opens up, does the opposite. How interesting. We don't know what's going on. How fascinating. And then they invite others in. Come on, let's get a group of diverse people together. The answer may emerge within the group. Very different approach. Now, I'm posing this as a very simple developmental model. There are three things about it. Firstly, it is nested. That is, the simple is contained within the complicated. And the simple and the complicated are nested within the complex. So when you're a complex thinker, it doesn't mean you throw away your rational brain. You still have your analysis, your thinking, and you still have your process view. So the more everything is nested. So that's the first point. The second point is that the complex thinker can understand the complicated and the simple. The complicated thinker can understand the complicated and the simple, yet the simple can only understand the simple. So the less developed cannot understand something more comprehensive. That's important. The third thing about this is a developmental model, because from a simple or a complicated perspective, we think that development's about learning more stuff, more processes, more tools, more techniques, more models. To a certain extent that's true, yet to actually shift into this domain, you need to work on this headspace. It's a shift in consciousness. It's about letting go, about relaxing, about not having to be right, about being open to feedback. It's a different way of operating. So let's get into complexity. Complex adaptive systems. We've touched on this. It's networked, it's interdependent, it's interconnected. It's a mystery. Adaptive, it constantly changes, and the changes change the changes. So it's always learning and growing. Systems. This is interesting. Systems comes from the Greek word systema. Basically, it means you put a circle around something and call that the system. Now, we tend to draw our circles in a very narrow way and a very short term. For example, the tobacco company, with the board getting together looking at the profit and loss, doesn't include the downstream effects of health in the nation through smoking. They have a very narrow view. So, complex adaptive systems are systems within systems. Take a human being. Within a human, you've got a vascular system, you've got a skeletal system, you've got a neurological system, all sorts of systems nested inside. Outside, that human is nested inside a family system, a social system, work systems, society systems, environmental systems, so it's all interconnected. Complex adaptive systems. I must touch it on this. This is 100 years ago. This is Jung. No, it's Einstein. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honours the servant and has forgotten the gift. So, engaging complexity is about reclaiming the gift. Now, we actually all know about this stuff. That's the funny thing, this isn't new. We all know this, and we also touch this. We know aspects of this too. Take a sporting team, for example. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. Rugby, cricket, netball, soccer, any sporting team. Now, there's a simple aspect of it. You know, you learn the techniques, you practice, you rehearse, you learn whether you're practicing your bowling or whatever it is. There's a complicated aspect where you're actually planning, looking at scenarios, looking at game plans. Then there's the game itself, and it's complex because it's unpredictable. Unexpected things can happen. And we all know the experience. Everyone's had it at some time in life where you get into the zone, or the flow, or the groove, when suddenly the complex domain opens up and magic happens. And that's what we're interested in here, is finding ways of making this happen. Now, I want to get into a couple of key concepts. One of them is one word. Emergence. Now, this is a very simple model. No one can draw emergence. I've got some bubbles, some agents, circles. Now, they interact. Now, If we're talking about a social group, these bubbles are human beings, people interacting. Or if we're talking about within a brain, these bubbles are neurons. Or if we're talking about a mind, these bubbles are thoughts. They interact. Or we could talk about an environmental system. It can be anything in the world. Any living system. Now they interact away. Now through their interactions, regularities start to appear, which form patterns. Then these patterns give feedback, which changes the way these bubbles interact, which changes the regularities, which changes the patterns, which actually gives more feedback. That's how it works. Now this emergence is always happening. Whether you know it or not, that's always happening. Something happens, which changes what happens, which changes what you do. On Saturday morning, I was reading The Guardian, and there was an article about this extraordinary new movement in Paris. That changed my whole presentation. That's the way it works. Spontaneous change, ever learning, and the changes change the changes. It's amazing. If you look at the human brain, there are something like 10 billion neurons inside your head. Now these neurons operate only in the local populations of 15,000. I don't know how many 15,000s there are in 10 billion, but that's a lot. And these neurons interact only locally. And they interact by either connecting or ignoring. That's all they do. So, local populations, no central control, no master program, yet this extraordinary mystery of a human being works. Emergence is amazing stuff. Now, classic example of emergence. I'm sure you've seen birds flying, a flock of birds. It's amazing. Then suddenly they all turn. Or a school of fish swimming, then shoo, they change direction. That's emergence. Spontaneously self-organising, moment by moment. Now, through most of the 20th century, this was a mystery to science. Biologists, naturalists kept studying birds and herds of animals and fish. Why are they doing this? What's this about? Now, they couldn't understand it because they're looking at it through the complicated mind, the command and control worldview. Because they're looking at the birds or the fish and they're going, well, who's in charge here? Who's the lead bird? Who's controlling it? No idea. So only in the last 10 years or so, with the advent of really complex computer programs, there's a mathematical program called Boids. Then they discovered that all flocking behaviour, whether we're talking about birds or fish, all over the world, all species, is governed by 3 rules. 3 rules only. What governs the movement is, number 1, they keep the same distance from each other. Number 2, they all go at the same speed. Number 3, they all move to the centre. Those 3 rules govern the flying of birds, the way schools of fish move, the way animals run in a herd, and the way they suddenly all change at once. That's emergence. Spontaneous, rapid change. Currently, the University of Sydney is studying fish to work out traffic control behaviour. Because the patterns, if they crack these mysteries of emergence, they can apply this to human stuff. Now, networks. This is the juice of this stuff. Networks, communities of practice, systems of influence. Now, this is the game. Sports New Zealand, you crack this, you crack massive change. Now, networks. Networks are the only form of organisation on the planet used by living systems. All living systems use networks. Whether we're talking about bees creating a beehive, ants building an ant nest, fish swimming in the sea, networks. So whether it's fish, it's animals, birds, or human networks, social, we're all in so many networks. Community groups, Facebook, LinkedIn, networks. It's a networked world. Everything is networked. Now, this is a relatively new insight. Why? Because we couldn't see it before. It's always been there. But when you look with a complicated mind, you miss it. You need a complex understanding, a shift in consciousness to see the networks everywhere. And once you see them, you've got the key for change. Because see, we connected to networks because of what we get out of them. You join a network for self-interest. Nothing wrong with that. And then if you don't get what you need, you drop out of that network and join another one. MySpace was the thing a few years ago. Who's on MySpace now? No one. Facebook. My grown-up kids tell me that Facebook's for old people. That's who's on it these days. Networks. They have fluid membership. People drop in, drop out. Yet some networks grow, and what happens? Communities of practice develop. Now, the difference here, a community of practice, people volunteer into it. They commit into it. And it usually has some sort of higher purpose, some deeper meaning. And it draws the best in people. And it's often about spreading the news and enhancing the practice. I was working last year with Australian Catholic University in the health sector, teaching network stuff to doctors and medical staff. And they said, oh yes, we know this. So this head of the emergency team, he and his peers around the country had developed a community of practice where they put their best ideas in, which they share with each other. And communities of practice, when they connect up, sometimes create systems of influence which changes the world. Let me give you one example. Do you remember in Carter? This, I don't know how long ago it was, 10, 20 years ago. This was Microsoft, the most powerful software organisation, computer organisation in the world, teamed up with Encyclopedia Britannica, the most prestigious encyclopedia in the world. And they were going to take the world by storm. Now, you no longer needed this huge library of books. You could have a couple of CD-ROMs which you could buy from Microsoft. This was going to be a brilliant money spinner. At the same time, a group of hippies using open source software started this weird thing called Wikipedia, where people volunteered for it. Nobody got paid. And even worse, anybody could correct it. Now, you know what? If you want to find out about Encarta, do you know where you have to look? Wikipedia. Because what they developed there was a community of practice where people volunteered to buy into it, to contribute for the greater good. And then it became a system of influence. Now, it's not the last word, but Wikipedia is the first word. All over the world, you want to learn something, you start with Wikipedia. Then you look elsewhere. Now that's what can happen when a network opens up to this next level, community of practice, and then becomes a system of influence. I've been working in Sweden for 20 years now. And a number of years ago, about 8 years ago, I started working with these researchers. And we're looking at the network society. How do we shift and change society with technology? And these researchers were a company called Ericsson, you're all familiar with. Now, Ericsson spends a lot of money on research. They invest so much of their money, their profits into research, because that's where they make their money. Like the Apple iPhone, Ericsson loves that. Apple make lovely cases, lovely smooth interfaces, but all the smarts inside it are Ericsson patents. They make more money off the iPhones than just about anything else. So these researchers were the elite. They got a new CTO who decided command and control, and he's going to put toll gates on them. He's going to put goals on them. He wanted monthly reports. What's your progress towards the next big thing? Of course, if you know anything about creativity and innovation, this just kills it. So the leaders were just freaking out because the morale just went through the floor. The CTO's jumping up and down, wanting monthly charts and report back and feedback, and everyone's freaking out. So I worked with it. Now, as a case study, this is where the work is. The hard work was with the leadership team. So I got the leaders, there were about 20 of them coming from all over the world. And we had 2 days together. And I took them through this stuff around networks and about emergence and self-organising systems. And I said, what we've got to do is we've got to set up an environment where people can do their own thing and they can flourish. Our job as leaders is to create the safe space, to give them the equipment and the tools, and let them self-organise. And of course they're at it, well, how can we control it? How can we make sure they do the right thing? You can't. You've got to step out of the way. It was a really tough call because I was going against their wiring about control. So then I said, we've got to create the environment to allow communities of practice to evolve around big ideas. They got that. But of course they got it with their old mind. They wanted to turn them back into work groups. They could, well, how can we monitor these communities of practice? How can we control? You can't. That'll kill it. They eventually got it. That their job was to actually open up this space and protect the organisation from the mad CTO with all his demands. So we got something like 120 people together. We got all the people from China, from India, from Japan, from the US, from Spain, from several Eastern European countries. So we got all these people in one room together. This is complexity at work. Open up this stuff to them. Of course, they're really sharp, really bright people. Most of them got PhDs. They got immediately what I'm talking about. Now, the promise we offered them was that they could develop their best ideas, the things I'm most passionate about, and spend 20% of their time on it. Because the boss is going, how are we going to control it? You can't. Anyway, you can imagine the scene, 120, 150 people together, and we say, okay, now, the answer is in this room. The best and brightest are here. We want you to actually get together and work out the best ideas. So you've all got something that you're so passionate about. So you can imagine 150 people turning to each other, trying to convince each other their idea was the one. It was pandemonium. It was crazy. Yet after about an hour and a half of amazing noise, it settled. It self-organised, because it always does, into about 10 big ideas. A couple of them were connected to what they're already doing. A few were just out of the box, and some were just crazy. Now, just one of those ideas turned out to be worth hundreds of millions. You know, you're all familiar with the cloud, right? Now, nobody had worked out how to actually make it secure. One of those ideas was making the cloud secure. That idea alone was worth a fortune. And that it was allowed to pop up by creating the environment. This stuff is always happening. What we've got to do is shift our headspace, start to open up the complexity, and see the networks that always exist and work out how to nourish them. So of course, what happened? One of those ideas changed the world. It's a sad story in the end, if you tell the truth. 8 months later, the CTO got his way and killed the whole thing. And morale went down again. But you know, you start again. The ideas were still alive anyway. Now, what changed my talk? The Guardian on Saturday, and it was actually repeated in your local newspaper yesterday, the Dominion, about this thing that's happening in Paris. This is a movement that's 10 days old. This happened, first thing was March 31st. Excuse my French, as they say. Nuit debout. I believe that loosely translates, if you say it properly, as rise up at night. So this happened, the first one of these happened on March the 31st. After a Labor demonstration, the group just stayed there all night, talking. And they started to self-organise. It's only been going for 10 days. So every night, they get together in the Place de République and talk. And people could talk about anything. They passed the microphone around. Anyone could say whatever they liked. Now, it was freaking the authorities out. What the hell do you do with this? What's going on? Because it wasn't the usual suspects. There weren't all the usual union movement and the socialist left. Those organisations weren't a part of this. This was ordinary people. This is housewives. This is pensioners. This is students. This is teenagers, all coming together and talking about what's really pissing them off and really frustrating them about the world and France. All sorts of topics being covered. So a network's forming. It popped into, now it's in Toulouse, it's in Lyon, it's in Nantes, it's also now started in Belgium. It's just spreading spontaneously. And it's starting to move into, I thought, it's becoming communities of practice are forming. Because they've got some feedback systems. And feedback is the key here. Feedback is so important. So, people talk. This means yes. This means no. So the crowd is giving instant feedback to their opinion about the conversation. Communities are forming. There's a committee emerging, looking at what are our values, what are we on about. There's another committee forming around accommodation. Look, let's build some wooden shelters here, so that we, in case it rains. There's a group of poets forming, saying they're going to document what's going on, and they're going to actually write the slogans and the songs. Interesting. Now, who knows? It may just fizzle out, or it may be the beginnings of a world-changing movement. The Arab Spring started like this. Networks. Our job is to actually encourage networks, because they already exist, and help people connect together. Encourage communities of practice, so that we can change the system. Now, I want to go through a couple of the big ideas around this, and then we'll have a few questions. Now, this is the first one. This is what freaks people out. There is no central control. That doesn't mean there's no control, because that's how the process mind hears it. No central control. Control is distributed through the system. That's how it always works. So just get over it. You can't control life. No one is outside the system. This fantasy of objectivity. Now, you've all had this experience. You're in a meeting and suddenly the big boss walks in and he says, "No, don't mind me, I'm just observing." Sure, the meeting just carries on as normal, doesn't it? Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The observer changes the experience. No one's outside the system. The observation changes what's being observed. Another one. You can only act locally. Hello? Local, local, local. That's how change happens. It only happens locally. This grandiose fantasy about how great strategic plans and set and forget, it doesn't work. Local, 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 local. Our job is to work locally. Find local heroes. Nourish people. Spotlight them. Give them attention. Give people resources. Again, let direction emerge from action. Most of our vision statements and our strategic plans, they're a defence against anxiety. That's what they're for. You work out the big plan, you put it in the drawer and forget it. They actually have very little connection to reality. Direction emerges from action. This is a hint. 25 years ago, I did something which changed the world. Now, I was called in to help software development. I know nothing about software, but I know about humans. So the approach was called a waterfall. You had developers, second-class citizens called testers. Developers would design something, throw it over the water to the testers. who'd see it doesn't work, and they'd try to get back to the developers who were doing something else and didn't want to know. Long, complicated, 3-year process with thick binders and rules and regulations. Now, I thought that was crazy, so I suggested, why don't we put designers and testers together in small teams and let them work on a little bit, and let's build feedback into the system. So every Friday afternoon, we'll get together and reflect on what we did last week. Every Monday morning, we start with, what do we need for the week? And how can we support you? So a few simple things like that. Creating space, creating environments, a few simple rules. We develop software in half the time with half the number of people. In the old language, that's called man-hours. So half the time, half the number of people, higher quality than ever, and morale went through the roof. Now, that went around the world like that. Unfortunately, I didn't make a dime out of it. And just about all software in the world is developed that way now. It's called Agile. If you know anyone who's into software development, ask them about Agile. Because that's how they do it. Self-organised, in small teams, in small sprint runs, lots of feedback, lots of reflection. Then you learn what you're doing off what you learn, then you build the next bit, then you build the next bit. That's how it works. Now, this one, relationships matter. This is fantastic. Remember the bubbles? The most important thing is the connections between the bubbles. Connectivity is more important than content. I've been working for years in the business world, and they say, oh, Peter, you do the soft skills. Hey, the soft skills are the hard skills. The relationship stuff is the most important thing. Relationships are the key. So our job is to nurture relationships and build connectivity, build the connections, build the pipe. When you build the connections, you build the network. That's our job. You know, all organisations are conversations. That's all it is a conversation. If you want to change your organisation, change your conversation. Holding a different conversation, you'll have a different organisation. That's our job. Change the conversation. Build networks, build relationships, build connections. Let direction merge out of action. Get a small group of people together, do something, reflect on it, learn from it, then do the next thing. That's how change happens. Good enough to go, suboptimal. You don't have to be perfect. I remember in 1999 I was working in Sweden. Do you remember the year 2000, how the world was going to stop and all the clocks were going to work, the computers were all going to blow up? There was this team, it was about August 99. They were working on the V2K fix. This was the perfect solution. The only trouble was it was going to be ready in March 2000. But it was Rolls Royce. Good enough to go. Suboptimal. Of course, that's contextual. I want my flight controllers good enough to go to be a lot better than other things. It's contextual. You know, good enough to go. Suboptimal. You know that old joke about two people being chased by a lion and one turns to the other and said, hope you can outrun the lion. He said, don't have to. All I've got to do is outrun you. You just need to be a little bit better. We waste so much energy gold plating things. Good enough to go. I remember working with these researchers a number of years ago, and the head from the Japan research company, he burst into tears when we talked about this. Now, that's quite shocking itself, Japanese saving face, but it just struck him so deeply because his whole life had been about exquisite perfection. Japanese culture and Zen and just making everything just so perfect. We go, no, good enough to go about halfway along. He realised how much of what he'd been doing had just been wasting energy. Doesn't have to be perfect, it's just got to be good enough. And again, diversity. Diversity, difference. When I'm setting up a meeting, I want to know who's going to stuff it up if they're not here. I want them in the meeting. Yes, it'll be uncomfortable. Fantastic. we'll learn stuff. Because groupthink kills things. Now, just on, I'll tell you one of my heroes, Sir William Hudson, New Zealander, but in Australia we call him an Australian. You know, that's what we do with everyone. You know that. Anyway, Sir William Hudson, he developed perhaps the greatest engineering feat of the 20th century, which was the Snowy Mountain scheme. I don't know if you know about it. But what it did was, it diverted the water. Instead of flowing out to sea when it hit the mountains, it went down through these tunnels for hydroelectrics, and then it rolled through the Murray River all the way to South Australia. So it increased the food production. It provided, still today, 70% of baseload power in the peaks from Brisbane to Adelaide are produced by the Snowy Mountain scheme. Now, it's 1947, just after, you know what, the Second World War. He's got thousands of people working there from 30 different nations. So you've got Germans, you've got Poles, you've got French, you've got Russians, you've got English, you've got every European nation. And you can imagine what the morale was like, what the culture was like. Now, he put this together. It was just amazing. What he did is he had an overarching big picture about building the nation, something worth going for. And then he provided pictures. He provided feedback and communication. Every week, every Monday, he had diagrams and pictures so that everybody knew what they were doing and how what they were doing was connected to the big picture. Because if you know what you're doing, you can make informed decisions. You can actually add value. Now, that was radical in 1947. Amazing man. I was telling the story a couple of years ago to working in one of the banks in Australia, and one of the men said, he remembers him because his father worked on it. His father used to come over and tell him about the man who made pictures. So you New Zealanders have been doing this for a long time. Create the big picture, something worth buying into. Communicate it in ways that people get it and they're involved. Okay. So listen, let's have some questions. It's been, I know. So, anyone? I'll take anything.
I think it's an observation on the question, but it's just that when you look at some of the concepts you're outlining here, you see the same set of behaviours in children when they play.
Absolutely. Beautiful, thank you. Yeah. Kids, you don't have to learn how to do this. We all know it. Because see, the development is really about unlearning, reclaiming that spontaneity. Yeah. I remember years ago in a workshop, this woman was talking about how she was on a bicycle and she fell off and she didn't touch it for 5 years. Now, was she learning to ride that bicycle as an adult or a child? Adult, of course. A child just falls off and gets up again. But we go, oh no, made a fool of himself, won't do that again. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Kids know this intuitively. And we actually all know this intuitively. It's about unlearning, about getting in touch with that more spontaneous self. Because there's a hunger for it too. Yeah. Yeah.
Peter, earlier on you talked about reactions of different types
Yeah.
problems. You talked about simple, getting loud, complex and complicated, analysing and explaining.
Yeah.
When I'm confronted with a complex problem,
Yep.
my first reaction is to try and help people simplify it
Yep.
into bite-sized chunks.
Yep.
In light of what you've been saying, should I be rethinking how I approach complex solutions and complex problems?
I think it's a good thing to do to reduce things down to bite-sized chunks. So William Hudson, that's what he was doing with his visual maps. The more important thing, though, is our attitude. Because the big thing we've got to deal with is anxiety. And anxiety is what kills creativity and innovation and openness. And it starts with us. We have to deal with our own anxiety. Because otherwise all we're doing is amplifying our anxiety and freaking everyone else out. So one of the things about reducing things, simplifying things, is that reduces anxiety. So it's a fabulous thing to do. And I think the more important work, it starts with us, is because we want to create trust. Because people will experiment when they feel it's okay, when it's safe to fail. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm trying to visualise or understand in that you talk about the American military,
Yeah.
how they took this way of thinking, and they've got so many locations,
Yeah.
such a complex organisation. How do they create the environment or initiate that change?
Okay. Now, in the pre-reading, there's a 2-page paper on it, and there's also all this stuff I've done today. There's about a megabyte of it on it. But just to answer your question with the military, the first thing they did was focus on building relationships, because the thing about a command and control top-down thing, you've actually got very few relationships. So they started to build connections, teams of teams. The second thing they did was build consensus, which is having a sense of purpose, a sense of vision, like you've got, enriching lives. So I remember reading one general said, now his job is about building consensus. The third thing they did was they distributed information, because information is the key. So that they made it so that just about anybody could get hold of quality information so they could make informed decisions. Again, back to Sir William Hudson, 1947, that's what he did, disseminating information so that people can actually make informed decisions. And the last thing they did, which I think is the most, I'd be fascinated how they did it, was they encouraged dissent. Now, traditionally, our fantasy about the military is that it's all command and control and you obey orders no matter what. They encouraged dissent because they didn't want groupthink. So that's my understanding of what they did. Anyway, it's fascinating because what they wanted to do was be nimble. And the thing about a network is it's fast. And the bigger the network is, the faster it is. Yeah.
Just wondering from your perspective, from a national organisation, what's your best piece of advice around operating in a complex world?
Shift your headspace. Yeah, because see, a lot of the people who are writing about this stuff, they frame it as if it's like situational leadership. Oh, in this instance I'll do complex stuff. On this instance I'll do complicated. As if there's fantasy, there's some detached observer who's making decisions about which mode to use. That just misses it. It's about growing as a human being so that we're less defensive, more open to feedback. Just think about not having to be right, not having to know the answer. When you get a hold of that, your life changes. Because many people frame leadership as about being in control, knowing the answer. So if they don't know, they feel foolish, or they pretend they know. So the single most important thing we can do is grow as human beings so that we can actually, in a way, I would say, to simplify it all, is about moving from the head to the heart. Because in the head, we're judging. My opinion, your opinion. In the heart, we connect. In the heart, there's no distinction. So we're talking about the complex domain is about relationships. It's about culture. It's about innovation. About creativity. It's about leadership. It's about self-organising. So that needs trust, needs openness, and needs creativity. And it starts with us as leaders. The good news is we're the limit of the system. The bad news is we're the limit of the system. Yeah. And look, I'd like to leave with a metaphor. And we actually all know this. The leader as host. If you're looking for a new model of leadership, the host. Now, every one of us has been to a good dinner party that really works. Or we've held a good dinner party. What does a good host do? They prepare beforehand. They have all the food and all the requirements. They create a safe environment so the boundaries are safe. The bikies aren't going to break in the middle of the dinner party. They actually take some time thinking about who to sit next to who so that they build what will give us really good connectivity. Don't put them in opposite, they'll fight. That'll ruin the evening. Oh, these people, they've got a lot in common, that'll work. So they spend time working out how to actually organise it. And then they just let it happen. A good host doesn't dominate or control. They may go and introduce people. Oh, have you met so-and-so? They connect people, they network, they join people together. Then they get out of the way. So, Sports New Zealand, leaders as hosts. You're the hosts. Create some really cracking dinner parties. Get some really good parties going. Because when people have fun, they learn a lot. You know, to me, it comes back to this. Enriching lives and inspiring a nation. Be good hosts. Okay. Thank you.